So with that introduction, I want to turn over the discussion to my colleagues, Dr. Rutledge and Dr. Tuma.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. And Pam and I think as Brian said, we really want to make this interactive. And so we're just going to go around with a series of statements. And I'm going to start first because I'm sort of going to look at the landscape of social media and kind of sort of set that terrain within this war in Ukraine that's going on. Let me just say that as a faculty member in media psychology, I'm very much interested in social media, very much interested in sort of the role of social media in our society, in public discourse. And so it's fascinating to see what's going on. But I also want to say that as a social psychologist who works in media, it's also quite fascinating because it's almost like we're getting to see attitudes in the making by seeing what's going on with social media content in Ukraine. But also for me, it's extremely interesting to take a look at this content and then to also ask the question of, well, how does then that influence, right? Attitudes in the United States, for example, political attitudes towards democracy. And there are a lot of things going on there, and hopefully we can get to that later on because that's a little more specific. But I'd like to set the terrain, and then my colleague Pam will come in with some things that she's been observing. To me, I was teaching this term a class on social media and conspiracy. And actually, I would say that was actually a very depressing class, because to a certain extent, what we've been seeing on social media since 2016 is really a vessel for misinformation and conspiracy theories. I mean, we've seen it all, beliefs that, I was actually thinking that years ago, we'd never think that people saying that, there are, lasers in space and there are lizard people, that we would consider that to be, actually, if people had said that 20 years ago, we would have been highly alarmed, right? In terms of that content. And I think of the classic study in social psychology by Rosenhan, when he actually sent people to what was then, he termed it the mental hospital. And he actually had his students go in and say, I'm here because I hear voices that say this, this, and this. And I think about that seminal moment, especially since I've been teaching the conspiracy in social media, because social media allows us to see it so well. If people showed up, if Rosenhan were to do his study today, what would be the threshold for us to say, Houston, there is a problem here, in terms of the contents of these beliefs? But I'm happy to report that we have seen a change in social media, so that since 2016, it's all been conspiracy. But right now, what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine is sort of a going back to its sort of liberatory project, right, that it was attached to, right? And so what we're really seeing is social media, the content, the personal stories, very personal. I have, seen people that I don't agree with them politically, but they're all riveted to what's going on and saying what is happening is terrible. So what we're really seeing is very gripping content, very personalized content that we have not seen since those movements that we saw early on in 2009. If you go back to the Green Movement in Iran, the Arab Spring, the movements in Spain, the Indignados, the tent movement in Israel. By the way, I know about a lot of these because I've had students that, I had one that, did a dissertation on that tent movement in Israel, and she brought that to my attention. And the content on social media is also nuanced, right? It is gripping. So we get to know people personally. When there are incidents of heroics, people who take chances both inside Russia and in Ukraine. But we're also seeing on something we don't normally associate social media with, that is nuanced coverage, right? So for example, they actually, there were social media posts that picked up on sort of the racial issue with immigration, and how perhaps the Ukrainian refugees, part of it was that, you know, these were all white Europeans going into neighboring countries. And we actually saw people, you know, who were studying, you know, in Ukraine, people of color who were having issues actually migrating to other countries. But I just want to say that the ugly side is still there, and I don't want you to think that I'm just saying it's over. I think that what we're now seeing is the fact that these platforms are sort of like the Gestalt psychologist said, they're Gestalt figures, right? And that is that they can be used both for, you know, for good and for doing, you know, this is what social media does best. But we also have to recognize that social media also do conspiracies really, really well. So Pam, I'm gonna stop there for now and sort of send it over to you.
Okay, well, let me take a little bit more of a micro view, and thank you, Regina. Regina and I meet frequently, and we always spend hours talking, and we hardly ever get the business that we're supposed to be getting done because we have so much fun talking about this stuff. But I want to take a little more of a micro view, because what's happening right now with the Ukraine is very interesting, because it has been called the TikTok war, right? Whereas the Arab Spring was the Twitter war, now we're seeing all of this activity on TikTok. What is making TikTok so powerful, right? So there's a question, I mean, and maybe you're wondering, is TikTok really changing public policy? And that's one of those questions that we ask in media psychology. But I'm really interested in, why is TikTok so popular, and what is it that makes it so persuasive? Because what it's doing is establishing a narrative for the Ukraine invasion. So if you think about the way the brain learns, like the way we learn everything, is that we take in information from all kinds of sources. We take all these little bits and we put them together like a giant quilt. TikTok is giving us all those little bits of fabric. And because it's our Western world, right, we're seeing the Ukrainian side of this, not the Russian side particularly. We are getting this very, as Regina said, nuanced picture of all of these voices from the Ukraine. And probably the more interesting thing about that is that the Ukraine was full of influencers, right, that were already on TikTok. So these young women have thrown aside their beauty videos, and they're now walking you through their bomb shelter. Or more also interesting is that they'll take a TikTok challenge, right? What's normal here, or what, you know, a day in the life, and they'll put it to pop music, and then they'll show this devastation of an apartment building. So there's this very interesting juxtaposition of humor and seriousness that psychologically allows us to process the information in a much safer kind of way. Or memes that encapsulate a very large amount of information in a very small but poignant piece of imagery. Imagery gives us all of this information where text does not. So there's this incredible amount of information flow that's being translated into the voices of these platforms. And so good news, bad news is we have a lot of young people more interested and involved in the Ukraine invasion than probably ever before, except for possibly the 60s. Date myself here a little bit, but the teenagers were into that one too. But where there's all these young people who not only are following it, but they're having a point of view. They're translating what's happening into their own language. A real sign of the power of TikTok is the fact that the White House invited TikTok influencers to a briefing to give them a better understanding, because they were already talking about it. They were already establishing a narrative without the facts. So it's that all of this stuff has made TikTok incredibly powerful. The other thing that I think is very important, and I know, Regina, this is something that you address a lot in your social media classes, is that the algorithm for TikTok is materially different than the algorithm of other social media platforms. You are shown things based upon what you like, what is popular, but you don't have to be following someone. So it's an algorithm that promotes things to the top that you might not see if you were on Instagram. So it's caused a lot of information from coming out of the Ukraine, because it's so raw, because it's so gritty, or because it's that humorous juxtaposition of a soldier on the field moonwalking, right? That has allowed it to spread and become viral and become so impactful. Regina, let me just, I don't take a breath, so, like, wave your arms if you want to say something, but I want to sort of open it back up to you about this sort of whole, how the algorithms are influencing what we see, because I know you spent a lot of time on that.
Well, I actually wanted to add something to what you said. When you said that, these influencers on TikTok went from makeup to discussing the war, and it reminds me of something that Clay Shirky had said back in, would have been around 2008 or 2009,
Yep.
when he actually talked about this ability of social media to have so you cultivate an audience and they follow you. And so that makes it really, gives you a lot of power, because and I remember the example that he used about a woman who was just, selling things or talking about whatever, and then all of a sudden becomes interested in a prisoner and started just talking about this person's case. And so what you do is you have an audience, right, that then it's easy to then switch and begin to sort of, discuss things that create awareness. The other thing that I want to say is that, Pam mentioned TikTok, but we could also talk about YouTube. And the one thing we need to mention is that Ukrainians are extremely tech savvy. I mean, in that way, they are really, really good, be it both, just the everyday people or even their government, right, at using social media. And so if you look on YouTube, much maligned recently, because you could go into the rabbit hole of misinformation and QAnon, right? You also get to see these video blogs, follow the life of a person. One blogger that I follow is Elena Guinez, and she's with her 3 kids, and we get to see her life and the horrors of what is going on. So, I mean, they are amazing at putting out their stories. And I also, Pam, in terms of the social media ecosystem, I want to do a shout out to sort of a kind of social media or participatory media that we don't really talk enough about, which is podcasts, right? I mean, we hear about podcasts with Steve Bannon, but we're also getting these great podcasts that I forget his last name, the philosopher Volodymyr, okay, I forget the last name, but he has this great podcast on Ukraine. The discussions there are extremely deep, bordering on philosophy, on government, on what is democracy, what is freedom, and it's there for everyone to access. And so, I mean, I do think that we are seeing a reversal back to what social media were. Pam is correct. I mean, the the algorithms have changed, and a lot of the misinformation, or that one friend of mine yesterday said to me, a colleague here said, at what point do we call it misinformation and see it as part of a strategy, a kind of propaganda strategy? to misinform. And I thought that's quite interesting if we were to think about it in that way. But in terms of the algorithms, they do make a difference, Pam. Twitter has made many changes to its algorithms, as has Facebook. And recently, I've been reading a lot. There's a social psychologist out here at NYU talking about how, and citing studies that talk about how it is that when you change the algorithm, right, it tends to promote things that, you know, like conspiracies, right? Because it's the most watched gets spread, the most shared is the thing that everybody gets to see, as opposed to, you know, Twitter's early timeline was really just, you know, it was really like what you're talking about in terms of TikTok, right? Which leads me to another question, Pam. As you were mentioning TikTok, it's quite interesting that the last I checked, TikTok was it TikTok that was really owned by the Chinese government?
Yeah, TikTok is owned by the Chinese government, which means that there's a lot of questions about data. Now, the people who run TikTok in the US say that there is a wall between, you know, the Chinese and the US versions of the company. You know, that's a user beware question. So far, it hasn't changed the content, but what, you know, but it is a factor as we sort of move into that kind of global aspect.
Mhm.
I think that what we need to remember, and I don't know, is social media going back, or was it ever terrible? You know me, I spend a lot of time over the positive psychology bucket. So I'm looking at the ways that social media facilitates connection, or that it gives people a voice. And so there's a lot of positive stuff that's been going on all during QAnon. In other words, there are still people connecting and doing all that. But what's happened is the technology has become richer. TikTok is all video. Instagram now has video. You know, it's all cross-platform. It all moves. Is that video is very emotional. And so it becomes much more engaging and much more persuasive. And so I think that's, you know, good news, bad news is that it allows misinformation to spread, because misinformation, especially, or I should say disinformation, intentional misinformation, is built to persuade, right? Which means they read the psychology book too. They know how to trigger emotion, and they do it usually with fear. But what you're also seeing is this authenticity, which is, I think, what is making this story about Ukraine and this larger narrative
Yes.
so impactful. And
Yes.
you're absolutely right. Zelensky, of course, came from the media, so he's very well practiced in how to deal with the media. But he also understands that he has to be authentic. He can't be Putin behind a long table in the Kremlin. He's out on the street talking to Ukrainians, and so he's creating all these little micro narratives to make a larger story, which is exactly what happens if you think about transmedia storytelling, is that it's bringing together all these smaller narratives to create this larger meaning where there's a place for all of these voices, which means there's all these stakeholders. But what I saw yesterday, which I thought was fascinating, is the most recent edition of Adweek. You know, my area of interest sticks into branding and that kind of commercial stuff, is that Adweek devoted an entire edition entirely populated with content editors, photographers, all Ukrainian. So they just handed over that edition so that it could really showcase what Regina was talking about, which is this level of skill and expertise that's coming out of the Ukraine that has allowed this story to remain impactful, because social media has a notoriously short attention span.
Yes.
But all of these videos, all of this emotion made from primary content creators on the ground has allowed that emotional level to stay high and engaging and keep it in the public eye in a way that has not happened before. It hasn't sort of dieseled off and gotten sort of like dirty snow. It's stayed very fresh. And so I think that that's an example of this rich media power.
I want to sort of piggyback on something, and the way I'm going to do it is that Brian asked I think it was Brian. Brian, was that you or somebody asked a question about, oh yes, it was Brian, about do you think the public graphic vivid imagery from the invasion led to a faster response from governments to lend support? So I've been thinking about this because, you know, the horror of the images, right? And it's made me wonder, I mean, the atrocities, the Busha massacre, right? All of those things, right? When you open your social media feeds, and it's an ecosystem that then, you know, what goes on in social media does not stay on social media. It sort of feeds into, there's a whole sort of media communication ecosystem. So I was wondering, Pam and others here, what if we had social media during the Holocaust? You know, I mean, it really made me think right now. You know, this is where, you know, sort of the history of media becomes important, because during World War II, they did have the reels that would be sent over, and, you know, you could go, you know, they would get, you know, the reels coming, you know, film coming from World War II and the fighting and what the Americans were doing. And so people then would go to the movie house, right? And you'd pay whatever it was, and then you'd be able to see the news, that is the images that were coming, you know, but it was different then. It was a different media environment, right? So, you know, Brian, I don't know if you know this about me, but, you know, as a graduate student, I was really brought up as a social psychologist who really studied perception. I worked in Arian Mack's perception lab. And the one thing that we do know is that images are processed viscerally, right? I mean, and this was Pam was talking about, you know, you can get an image out and it's going to haunt you. I don't know if anybody here saw the Navalny documentary that CNN, it actually won an award at the Sundance Festival, and it's really an amazing documentary. But the thing that did not allow me to sleep, Pam, talking about images, was that last shot of Navalny recently in prison, unrecognizable, head shaved, right? Had lost weight, and the image is still there. So, Brian, images, yes, they haunt us. The ability to, that's why I said, if we had images of the Holocaust, because we only saw the horror, right? And I say we collectively, right? Because, you know, but we only saw the images after the liberation, right? And after the end of the war. We didn't really have a sense. But here, yesterday, I saw in the news that there was one individual who, he was in Busha, and what he did is he risked his life, and as the massacre was going on, he actually was using his phone to document the massacre, right? And he was asked, but weren't you concerned that the, you know, Russians would see you? And he said, yes, but I felt I had to do this. I had to document this for posterity, for history. So the answer to the question is absolutely. And images haunt us. And then we can get into, you know, this idea of the relationship between images and politics, and you know, some of these ideas coming from, you know, political philosophers and some from sociologists that talk about, you know, when an image is projected, and then what's the possibility of what they call aesthetic judgment. And that is that once an image is out there, right, it doesn't necessarily mean, it could be propaganda, but the ability to reflect upon can also cause what I like to say, the Gestalt switch in the image, where, you know, the background now becomes the figure. And so it gives us a kind of space to think through this. So So yes, long-winded answer, but clearly images are processed at a very different level, right? So much research shows that it's just processed, doesn't have, it gets in sort of peripheral processing. It does not need to be a kind of deliberate processing. So I think that's important. The other thing I want to say is that, and sort of social media, and I mentioned, the war, World War II and media, but I also want to say that like we also, I think I said it earlier, that we're also seeing a more traditional use of social media as a traditional outlet when you're getting both the government of Ukraine and Russia clearly trying to influence. Russia, of course, is doing it mostly with, gaslighting. And you're also, with, and you could tell which people are basically sort of, they're trying to push the Russian propaganda. And then, of course, then you're getting all this content from the Ukrainian government and, everything that statements that they put out formally. So there is that kind of traditional sense of media, even within sort of the ecosystem, within social media. Pam, I don't know if you want to
Sure, if I may just
don't ask the question because it will go on and on. Go ahead, Brian.
I just want to interrupt. We have a member of the audience had a question or a comment. Hasna, would you like to chime in?
Oh, yes, thank you so much. And it has been really interesting listening to your thoughts. And I just thought to add another point of view, because I worked as a war correspondent between 2004 and 2012. And it was a very interesting timing because I was in the middle of this shift, because when I started working, the foreign affairs was basically just in the interest of educated people between the age of, let's say, 35 and 70. Young people were not following wars at all. Mm-hmm. And we were working with very traditional tools. And it was, I think, in the mid 2000s when there was a kind of an experiment when cameras became cheap, that a director gave cameras to people in the Gaza Strip to record their everyday life. And it was a huge thing. The film eventually won a lot of awards because it gave a new perspective and a new insight to a conflict area. And in 2011, when I was reporting from the Libyan uprising, that was a huge thing for me to see how the tool itself, so not only social media, but the involvement of tools, how it changed just the outcome of the war. Because I think it was the first war when the young people started feeling they are empowered because they have the tools, the mobile phones, to record all those clashes where there were no journalists present at all, especially the first day, how terrible things the forces of Gaddafi did in Benghazi. Mm-hmm. And this country where they had no press freedom at all from the previous decades, these young people were able to establish a media center in 2 or 3 days. And they were smart enough to collect all these footages on CDs. They were still using these CDs, CD discs, and hand it out to journalists, which then put it in the traditional media. So there was already Facebook, but it wasn't as viral as now. And I think it was due to that eventually NATO interfered and paused the no-flight zone. So I think it was that war where we first saw that how just the involvement of tools themselves can actually cause interfering in politics and changing politics on a short term. So I just wanted to add that we have to look at social media, but I think tools are so important part of this whole idea as well.
Oh yeah,
I think.
Go ahead. Pam, you want to?
I was just going to say, you're absolutely right, because it lowered the barrier. I mean, the fact that you can take images for free and share them for free is a huge deal, and it just turned everyone on the street into a journalist. So it really created a groundswell, and we've seen that in other places. Although this is the first time we've had so much video, so sort of nonstop video. But I think another thing that's been very interesting, that's bringing in all these young voices, is the use of social media conventions with those tools. So the use of hashtags, Vladdy Daddy, these sort of viral trends that catch the attention of people who hadn't heard about it and made them interested and made them look. And so I think that, for example, Regina, where you're talking about podcasts, people get interested because they've seen something on some other platform or something has piqued their interest, and then they go look for more. So this fluidity of across platforms and the ability to access these platforms literally anywhere in the world these days. The last numbers I saw, which admittedly is now probably 3 or 4 years, 97% of the global population had access to a cell phone. That didn't mean they had a cell phone. Maybe there was like one in a village, but 97% of the people in the world had access, which is extraordinary when you think of the amount of, well, the amount of sheer information, of course, but about the amount of authentic experience that can come through. So thank you for that comment. I mean, that's really, really important.
I want to add something to Hesna's comments, because she makes us also think about, broader than social media, correct? The tools. And we are seeing, for example, the use of sort of GPS or location, the ability to locate certain images, right? And so when Russia says, no, that didn't happen, and then you see sort of satellite images or through GPS where, and they can locate. The news media are using these tools to say, okay, here was this street before, here it is now. So as journalists, correct? I mean, there's much more. And for example, when I remember CNN doing this, when they wanted to see where the location of something that happened, and they would show you sort of what was there now, they would locate the image because they try to fact check the videos that are coming in. And so they try to, through GPS and Google Maps and things like that, they will say, okay, so this is what was there before, now take a look at, right? So you're able to really counteract, through a lot of the things because it's coming from the bottom up. And I just want to say that also, because you do have traditional media using these new platforms to then fact check, I think it's adding a sort of a different perspective. By the way, as I just wanted to say that I actually got interested in social media because of 2009, and it was really my whole reason for being was the green movement in Iran, and that's what drew me in. But I also, Pam mentioned the hashtag. And so what is really interesting as a psychologist, right, is that when you look at hashtags, what are they? What you're really seeing is a principle of cognitive, or shall I say, social cognitive categorization, right? Because, attention is limited, right? And so cognitive psychologists, and then goes on to social psychology, we've been talking about how is it that we organize the world. And so the principle of organization is the creation of categories. And so what you saw with social media is that it was, as William James said, this sort of buzzing, streaming, it just, the stream of consciousness. Well, you need to organize it. And so what people did is that then they started with the hashtag movement. And so then now as psychologists, this is so fascinating to see these social psychological principles at work in the media, right? And so then the question that we need to look at is, well, what is, right, a hashtag, but what is a category? And to what extent are they real? Are there real limits to it? Are there sort of fuzzy boundaries? And so by exploring that, you can get through some of the narrative and understand how the narrative is being structured. So that's quite interesting. And I just want to add that there are a couple of other things that I am seeing as a psychologist. So for example, I actually got in touch with one of our graduates in the program who actually did work on leadership on social media during the 10th movement in Israel and the unlikely rise of Daphne, I forget her last name, who was a leader of a group and said, no, that's it, I've had it. I'm just going to put up this tent in Tel Aviv. And so my student actually studied sort of the social representation of leadership and how that notion was being changed. And you could see it in the course of this movement. Well, I would say that to any student here or any of our students, I got in touch with my student because I said, look, it's time to relook at leadership. Take another look at leadership, because one of the things that we see happening with Zelensky is that he is reminding us of what leadership can be. One that is attached to values, one that is attached not to freedom means I get to do whatever I want to do, but sacrifice for an ideal, right? And so he is reminding us in some sense, right? I mean, there are lots of studies on leadership in psychology, beginning with, Kurt Lewin, and his studies on leadership, authoritarian, democratic styles, sort of laissez-faire styles, and then moving on to modern studies on leadership. But I actually think that if anybody's interested in the understanding of leadership and the representation of leadership, that is a theme that is coming out here, and it could give us a glimpse of how perhaps the idea of leadership is being changed. And that's when I come back and say that this could very much affect how it is that that we view our own politics in the United States. And let me just say this last thing on that. When Putin denies what's going on, right, and you see the propaganda at work, in a way, implicitly, it might charge you to then be able to spot the tactics as they are being used here. Therefore, it is what Maguire called, inoculation theory. It's, in a way, it's inoculating you to the nonsense of our own politics. And that, my friends, I don't know the answer. I don't know. I don't know what will happen, but that might mean that there's a possibility for renovating our own political discourse in the United States through this and what we're seeing. And I'll just stop there because I went on a rampage here.
But I think you make a really interesting point about the impact of the social environment. Well, not even just social media, but the social environment and the connected environment on leadership, because it's really, I mean, as you've seen, it's really flattened hierarchies, and it's made the people at the top very accessible all the way down.
How ironic, yes, that it's reminding
yeah,
us.
And for the most part, shining a light on the things that you want to see. Now, Russia's had a big role in undermining confidence in information, which is probably their most effective offensive in terms of getting to do what they want and people leaving them alone, because it undermines public opinion and the sort of support from other countries. But there's an accountability that comes from all of this socialness if you're going to manage it well. And one of the things that I think has been fascinating is watching Zelensky has honest to God fans, as if he were, Elvis Presley, right? He has people making fan cams and fan edits that is a sort of derivative out of the K-pop movement, all over social media, showing him creating this narrative with him as the hero, very archetypal, very easy to understand. So we see all of this condensation of large amounts of information into archetypes and memes and things that are chunkable. I know that Regina set off on, chunking cognition stuff, but that are chunkable and memorable and shareable, which makes that narrative spread so much faster.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I wonder if there are any more questions. We've got about 15 minutes left. If anybody has any other comments or questions, or even questions about our program or anything. Someone after my own heart. Let's see. I have a preference for Twitter. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is it Bucola. Okay, I apologize. I have a preference for Twitter when it comes to serious news, especially news about distress in Ukraine. TikTok has interesting and believable audio visuals. However, comments and other engagements that make news trend are more available on Twitter. I agree. I think that there's something about that little bird that I love, except I'm dreading Elon possibly taking over. But it has become a space where you see a lot of journalists, right? And so you can get some very good sort of sources. There is a list that one journalist published, and so if you click on it, it's a Ukraine list, and they're all credible sources of information. It was either a New York Times or Washington Post journalist who curated that, and so I kind of latched onto that, and then you could get some really credible sources. But I think one of the things that we're seeing with Twitter is that it might be well, we get all types of people on Twitter, but not really, right? These social media platforms, we still have to look at when we talk about doing research on social media. I always caution students, take a look at who is on there before you go make any pronouncements, because it still is a sort of minority point of view, though you do get a sampling of what's going on. But I want to go back to something Pam said on TikTok, because young people tend to be more on TikTok, except, let me just say, that you're getting a lot more journalists now opening accounts on TikTok. And I've seen this, starting in about 2020, 2019, where some of the people that I follow are saying, well, I'm now on TikTok, right? But you know what happens? There's usually an exodus of the young kids when the adults, right, show up. And so it'd be interesting to see where they go. Now, just in terms of social media, we haven't even begun to talk about, what's happening with Snapchat, WhatsApp, and all these other things that are going on. And all of those are part of the ecosystem. And back to Hesla's comment about young people involved, and it's they really are involved in some of those more sort of other media forms, and perhaps not so much. We know that they're not necessarily on Facebook unless they want to stay in touch with their grandmas and their parents.
Well, Regina, that makes me want to ask you a question, which is, if about 30% of the US population, 25 to 30%, the last time I looked, was actually on Twitter, but 70% of all young adults and tweens and teens are on TikTok, how is that skewing political discourse? Because, I agree with you, there's a lot more serious stuff going on Twitter for the most part than TikTok, because it's still a melting pot of dance videos and challenges along with serious stuff and some dreadful stuff too, but that's different. But that skew of use has to make a difference. And when you have journalists going to TikTok, as you saw with them live streaming to Instagram, it, by the halo effect, kind of validates the platform. In other words, it is like, oh yes, this is a source of actual information. I can believe things that I see here. And so, this is where I would take a quick right turn and say we have to advocate for media literacy in the schools, because if you're going to really inoculate people like you were hoping to, you actually have to train them in critical thinking about media. But that's another side point.
Yeah, that's another. I just want to say, I have an 18-year-old in college, and I don't think he watches any news, right? But then when we talk about things in the world, I am surprised by what he knows. He's getting it somewhere, and it's not from CNN or MSNBC or NPR, right? Or
Fox News,
right? And it's quite interesting. And I just want to say that also, if you think about it, then there are these other social media platforms that have formed that have not been successful, like, Parler is not necessarily that successful. We know that the Truth Trump one has not been successful. Telegram is, and even Russians themselves can still get information through Telegram. But I know that there are questions, both Brian and Cecilia had one. Go ahead. So,
Well, I'll defer to Cecilia.
well, Cecilia wrote a comment. Let's see. Looking back at my notes, I hear social media success being comprised of 4 aspects: build an audience, be authentic or authenticate, provide live images with feeling, heroism, and then use a Gestalt switch to present a strategy. Am I way off in my interpretation? Well, I think those things are actually, Pam really dissects these elements. The Gestalt figure example, it's actually a perceptual switch, and that is, it's those ambiguous figures where you can see one thing or another. And I was kind of sort of looking at it from that perspective. The reality is that we don't.
But if you use that,
Yeah.
if you use that metaphorically, it's a great analogy, though, of something that content comes together to create a greater meaning. And so, to your point, Regina, the actual Gestalt switch is a sort of a perceptual thing, but there's a meaning making equivalent to that.
It's an interpretive. Actually, what they showed is that nothing new is coming into the eye, right? In terms of image or, coming into the retina light energy, it is happening at the interpretive level, and which is quite fascinating, right? But the one thing is that the Gestalt psychologist could not explain, no one has explained why the switch happens. And there was a movement in Germany after, I know these little tidbits, spend my life reading about this stuff. Movement that came after the Gestalt psychologist had to leave Germany because they were politically oppressed, because they were saying that there is the indeterminacy of the image, that one day propaganda, this is the meaning of it, propaganda, you can interpret things this way, the image, right? What you're seeing, but then at some point it switches. So there's freedom of interpretation. And that's why they actually had to leave Nazi Germany at the time, because that was seen as extremely problematic. So I will leave it there, but I do think, Cecilia, that those elements, and Pam agreed with you, you got it right. Brian, I think you had a question.
Yeah, and I know we only have a little time left. I'm not sure how you'd be able, if you'd be able to delve into this, but I wonder, how would you translate some of these many ideas we've been discussing into research projects or dissertations? What would that look like?
I have a couple of ideas. I contacted, as I said, one of my students who did work on leadership, trying to entice her, and said, listen, you did this project on leadership. So one of the things that I would actually be interested in is to taking a look at what notion of leadership are we seeing? And we do see it, right? Vis-a-vis Zelensky. And so, for example, and then I would then bring that back to attitudes within the United States and how those images, and take Republicans and Democrats, right? And take a look at, what they're seeing in these notions of leadership, and then take a look at their attitudes towards Ukraine, but also then ask questions about attitudes towards politics in the United States. I'd also be interested in looking at people who support the war, and not just through the leadership construct, but actually looking at people that have been divided in this country, Republicans and Democrats. And all of a sudden we're coming together and we're saying, this is bad. So I'd like to see, from a social representations perspective, right? Moscovici's theory, so it appears that we're coming together, but I would like to explore both similarities and differences in the representation, because that could really give us a sense of where is it that we really have commonalities and where do we see some differences that actually might be interesting as well, so that we don't just think, oh, we're all together on this, but here are some of the issues that are coming up as well. So, I mean, those are really two ideas that I've been thinking about in terms of looking at attitudes and notions of leadership and things like that. Pam, you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it would be very interesting to start compiling images or hashtags and try and construct the narrative that's being told from what we're seeing across media. I had one student who looked at how during the Parkland shooting or post-Parkland shooting, how those arguments were framed using traditional framing theory to see if social media framing actually follows that pattern, which it actually does not very well. But what were the most effective means of engaging an audience on Twitter, and what frames were the most activating, I guess I would say, because as you all probably remember, that the response from the Parkland kids who coagulated to a little group very quickly had marches across the country. I mean, that the sort of ripple effect of social media. So it's a very powerful thing when you start looking at how people are constructing the narrative frames, and if they're consistent and coherent, it really can lead to social change and policy change. Do we need to think up more, or are you happy,
No.
Brian?
Thank you. We're getting to the top of the hour. So I'll take the moment to thank both of you, Dr. Tuma and Dr. Rutledge, and to thank Erica and Ignacio for their assistance in putting this together, and particularly thanks to the audience with your attention and really good questions. And just a reminder, if you're interested in our graduate programs, we have information sessions, and we have a ton of information on our webpage about it. And Erica, is there anything you'd like to add?
Just want to echo, thank you so much. I felt like that was a very gripping and thought-provoking conversation. I really appreciate your time and your insight. And definitely to our audience who added their own thoughts and insights and experiences. I've really appreciated this hour, so thanks.
Also, I would like to extend an invitation, and Pam, I'm sure, I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure you would agree. If anybody here has any questions, the one thing that Pam and I love to do is to talk, as you can tell. So feel free to email me with any questions or any thoughts about the presentation or ideas that you might have. Always open to a conversation with anybody. So feel free to do that. And Ignacio or Erica, if you could send out, or Brian, I don't know, our emails. Pam, I'm sure you do the same.
Absolutely. When we send out the copy of the recording, we will send that along. Thank you for that offer.
All right.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you, Cecilia.
Really appreciate.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
We hope you
Thanks,
guys
everyone.
found it interesting. We continue to watch this, right? I mean, it's fast evolving, so we might have to do a take 2 and see what happens.
Very good. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.